Good morning from WKYT News. I'm Bill Bryant, and we welcome you to Kentucky Newsmakers. Our extensive coverage of Campaign 2018 continues this morning. It's one of the most closely watched U.S. House races in the country, and it's right here in our midst. Republican Congressman Andy Barr is hoping to hold off a challenge from our guest today, retired fighter pilot and Democratic nominee Amy McGrath. Barr is running for a third term in Washington, and this is McGrath's first run for political office. The race is tight in all the polls, and campaign ads have dominated the airwaves, as you know, in recent weeks. We've scheduled each candidate for separate appearances here on Kentucky Newsmakers. Congressman Barr will be with us next week, and WKYT is offering to televise a debate with both candidates in October. Today, retired Lieutenant Colonel Amy McGrath, the Democratic nominee, is here with us, and we welcome you back to Kentucky Newsmakers. You were a newly minted winner of the primary the last time you were here back in May. What has this campaign been like for you to this point?
Really, it's been great. I mean, people are sort of coming out of the woodwork and being a part of this, realizing that they need to be a part of their democracy and in an active way. And I've been excited with all the folks I've talked to, and it's really been a great campaign. A
little more background on you for folks who are just tuning into this race, although, again, they see the ads, and so they're always seeing your case and his case and the case of those who are running those ads
everybody else
everywhere. But you were a fighter pilot, and you also found yourself in an intriguing situation on 9/11.
Yes. So for me, I was a newly qualified backseater, weapons systems officer in the F-18, and 9/11 happened, and I was on the West Coast at Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, and we were told, hey, go into the ready room, go into the area where we get ready for flight operations, and I saw my name on the whiteboard because I was one of the only pilots or weapons systems officers who showed up that morning because they closed the gates. And so I found myself having to go to an F-18 with 6 air-to-air missiles loaded up, and I sat with a senior pilot on the runway, or right off the runway, for about 3 to 4 hours, and our job was to be ready to launch at a moment's notice to protect Los Angeles and San Diego.
What was going through your mind?
You know, what was going through my mind at that time was, I'm going to do a job. I'm trained to do this job. I'm ready to do this job. This is what my country asks of me, and I didn't think too much about that. More, I thought about, you know, the mission. So it was a very serious day. I was ready to do that mission, and you know, when I was relieved after the end of that 4-hour sort of watch period, I was personally relieved, but I was glad and willing that I was able to do that.
You end your military service, retired, and then you transition to politics. Why?
Yeah. I was fortunate enough to be surrounded by amazing leaders in the United States Marine Corps. And I was fortunate enough to be surrounded by amazing people who cared about their country before anything else. And I felt like we didn't have a whole lot of those leaders in politics today, and we badly need that in our country. And so that's been my mission. My mission is to be a change agent and somebody who looks at public office as a service and looks at it as a leader who wants to put the country and the people of the 6th District before anything else, before their political party. I think that's what we need in this country.
What has this transition been like for you to get into politics, to plunge in?
I plunged into everything in my life.
And in a situation here that this is a district with a large urban center in Lexington, a Democratic stronghold, surrounded by counties that have voted more conservatively over the years and gave Donald Trump a double-digit victory 2 years ago. It's a tough district.
It is. It's a challenge, but I like challenges, number one. But number two, what most people, I think, really want is a leader that just wants to put the people and the people of the 6th District, again, ahead of these labels of liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican. And I really think they want leaders with integrity, leaders of character, leaders who don't care so much about the labels, but just want to do the right thing. I think that's why we've got a very good reception in this campaign. You know, I always looked at this, and my husband's a Republican. I'm a Democrat. That's who we are as Americans. And we get along. And we can do this in this country as long as we can elect people who can kind of cut through this partisan divide. And I think the 6th District, you need somebody that can do that first before the rest of the country can.
The ads came roaring out a few weeks ago, back in August. You've had a lot of attack ads run against you by your opponent and by political action committees. You have benefited from some attack ads run by political action committees on your side. Have you been surprised at the way your own words have been turned on you in some of those ads?
Sure, and this is the problem with politics today. You can cut and splice anything. I decided when I was going to run that I was just going to talk to people, and you know, I was going to talk about the issues. I was going to be who I am. I was going to joke at times, and you know, that's the risk that you take in running for office, that you're taped all the time, and that little tape can be taken out of context and thrown back at you. And I'm just going to believe and hope that the voters see through this stuff.
So when you called yourself the most progressive person in Kentucky, was that a joke?
That was, yeah, I mean, it was essentially a joke, but it was based off of one issue, right? And I was talking about the fact that I was more progressive than anyone who has ever held this seat on a particular issue. And so, you know what? I'm conservative on some issues, I'm progressive on some issues. You can't put a label to somebody and say they're all this or they're all that. That's the problem with our country today.
Some observers have said that you may have lost some ground because the liberal label was sticking.
Sure.
And you've been called in the back pocket of Democrats around the country. Are you concerned about that gaining traction?
Well, you know what? I defeated the Democratic establishment in the primary, and now I'm going after the Republican establishment. So I didn't belong. I was actually an independent for many years of my life, and I didn't grow up within a political party, and I don't owe a political party anything. I'm running because we need better leaders in our country, and I think that that will speak for itself.
There has been a lot of discussion among political observers, and even an article done by the Lexington Herald-Leader. Can she win without attacking? You have not done that at this point. Have you been tempted to sharpen your criticism of your opponent because of the messages coming from that side? Do you take a chance of losing by not doing that?
Sure, I've been tempted. Look, my opponent has run 5 attack ads on me, and you know, he's the incumbent. When somebody who has their political party own the House of Representatives and the Senate and the presidency, and all he can do is attack, that ought to tell you something. And you know, I believe this is the problem with politics today. It's one of the reasons I'm running. Attack ads, people hate them. And we need to be more positive. We need to talk about the issues. We need to talk about what we're going to do for Kentucky, what we're going to do for the country. And this is what turns people off. And it's one of the reasons I'm running. So, you know, I am proud of the campaign that I'm running. I'm running a substantive campaign, a positive campaign, and I want to stick to that as long as I possibly can.
The political action committees, the so-called dark money in elections, they can say what they want.
They can.
And they do that on both sides.
Yeah.
Has there come a time in this campaign that you have felt that you wanted to disavow something that was said in one of those ads, including attack ads they have run on your opponent?
Well, there's only been one attack ad, to my knowledge, 1 or 2 run on my opponent, and those attack ads have been factually accurate. So I haven't wanted to disavow. I have no communication with these third-party ads, and this is really important for people to understand. understand. When an ad comes out, you need to look at who it's paid for, whether it's paid for by Amy McGrath or paid for by a third-party group. And because the third-party groups, this is the dark money. We don't know who donates to these groups, so this is a problem in the post-Citizens United world. It's one of the things that I want to tackle as a legislator in our Congress. I just don't think it's good to have any third-party groups.
What would you like to do with it? Keep that money out?
Well, the first thing you need to do is have better transparency with dark money. So right now, anybody can donate to a third-party organization, unlimited amounts, and there's no transparency. That person or that corporation or that individual can come from another country. And this is a problem with our country. And so I think that transparency is the first step. Beyond that, overturning Citizens United in the long run, I think is really important for our country.
What would you say to somebody who might say, though, well, you're keeping comments from being made about the election by people who want to be heard, and therefore it's a restriction of speech?
And I understand that point of view, but I do think that there needs to be some restrictions on it. And I do think, because we have unlimited amounts of money. I mean, it's crazy the amount of money, and we don't know who's buying these ads. We don't know who. We know the organization, but we don't know the donors. It's a problem with dark money. It's skyrocketed since Citizens United, and it's, in my opinion, totally corrupting our system, because these one or two groups can just frame the issues when no one else is really talking about those issues, and I think it's a real problem. Dark money is a very big, important problem in our country.
We're with Amy McGrath. She is the Democratic nominee for Congress in the 6th Congressional District in a race that's being watched around the country. And we will be back on Kentucky Newsmakers in a moment. We welcome you back to Kentucky Newsmakers on WKYT. Amy McGrath is with us this morning. She's the Democratic nominee for Congress in the 6th District, and Republican Andy Barr, the incumbent, will be with us next week. What is it like to run in a campaign that is being watched around the country, as we know this one is? I mean, this is, it's one thing to see it regionally play out, but,
right.
but both parties want this seat.
Sure. Well, I mean, for me, this is my first campaign, so I really don't have a benchmark to look at, and I just look at this as this is important for Kentucky, it's important for our country, and I'm just going to keep going.
If you had your choice of the issues that were emphasized in the campaign, what would the top 2 or 3 be?
Well, healthcare, number one. Why? Why? Because this is the most important issue to the people I talk to in all 19 counties in this district. People are still very worried about the premiums rising. They're still very worried that Republicans are going to throw them off their health insurance because they've tried over and over and over again to do that. So I think that's the number one issue. And folks want people elected who are actually going to work to fix the system that we have. So I think that's most important. Beyond that, good quality jobs. Look, the economy is doing well. By the way, it's been doing okay for the last 7-8 years, by the way. And so the GDP is increasing, and that's good. But who's benefiting? And what we see is that CEOs and the wealthiest 1% are the largest beneficiaries of this good economy. And for the average worker, it's not, the average wage isn't getting much higher. So I think we can't cut our way to prosperity. I think that's the other issue. Beyond that, it's everything from the opioid crisis here in Kentucky to you name it.
Let me run you through some of these issues,
Sure.
some of the things going on. First of all, if Democrats win control of Congress and there are impeachment proceedings, or there is increased talk of that as a result of a Democratic majority in the House, would you be on board with that being a priority?
Well, I'll be on board with accountability. So I think what has been left behind right now is we have a Republican Congress who is unable to stand up to the president in any way, shape, or form. And so I'm not for that. I'm for the Constitution actually working and for the Congress to actually hold accountable the executive branch and the president. With regards to impeachment, look, I've said this all along. I believe the Mueller investigation should come to a complete conclusion, and we should find out what happens. I think Robert Mueller is somebody who's very well respected on both sides of the aisle. And I think we ought to just wait for that to end and see what happens there.
Let me go back on health care, as you emphasize as a major issue. Your opponent has voted dozens of times to repeal the 2010 Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. Yeah. You have said, and said it here, that it could be tweaked or fixed. Right. What do you see in health care? You have talked about a single payer system. Some call that socialism, and you have bristled at that.
Well, I'm not for a single payer system. And I've said that all along. What I've said all along is if we were to start from scratch 70 years ago, a single payer could work. But I don't believe that today we should be going that route. Why? Because we have a very complex system, a system that does work for many people and doesn't work for other people. And we need to fix that system and make it better. Now, how do you do that? You do that by, one, shoring up the Affordable Care Act, not trying to undermine it, not trying to throw it away for purely political purposes, which is what my opponent has done over and over and over again. Two, you do practical things. I'm a military officer by trade. So we've got to look at this practically. I'm a practical person. Let's fix this. Medicare buy-in plan for those who are 55 and older. Hey, that's something that when you talk about it, people who are 55 and older, they nod their heads. This is something where you could buy into a system that everybody seems to like, that's secure, that's not going to throw them off for pre-existing conditions. It's going to shore up the Affordable Care Act because you're taking out a population that is riskier. Things like the public option. What's the public option? That's simply, hey, if you are under the Affordable Care Act exchanges right now and you have a choice of 1 or 2 or 3 private insurers, you know, Aetna, United, Blue Cross Blue Shield, I propose you also ought to have a choice of Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam as an insurer, kind of like what I have as a military retiree. And you can choose to buy Uncle Sam. And what would that do? If you want to choose it, choose it. And if you don't, keep your private or choose to buy your private insurance. What would that do is bring down costs, because now the private insurers would have to compete with the public option.
What do you say to those who say that you would be limiting choices of health care?
I'm not sure how you could say limiting choices, because I'm actually adding a choice. You know, to me, Andy Barr would love this because he loves choice, right? You're adding another choice of a government option.
But within those networks, I mean, the
Affordable Care Act networks,
right,
within the exchanges.
But they would have the choices that they would make and the agreements they make with the providers, who may or may not be on board if there was a system created that wouldn't reimburse them at their expected level.
So the private insurers would have to compete with a public insurance. So yes, and they would have to compete, and they would hopefully have to bring down some of their costs to compete with a public option. I think that's really important to note. Yes.
The Republicans are now pushing to make the recently enacted tax cuts be made permanent. What's your position on that?
Well, which part of the tax cuts?
That were put in, well, the ones that went into effect this year.
Well, see, the problem with the tax, what the Republicans did was they made permanent tax cuts for the wealthiest 1%, and they made permanent tax cuts for corporations. And they made not permanent, very temporary, the tax cuts for everybody else. So that in a few years, guess what? Every working individual and middle class individuals get their taxes raised. And I actually think that's a real problem. First of all, their tax plan is completely fiscally irresponsible. It added, now the CBO is saying it's probably $2 trillion to the national debt. And Andy Barr, he ran for office many years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, saying his #1 priority, guess what, was the national debt and the deficit. There's a problem with that, where the only major piece of legislation he's ever passed added $2 trillion to the national debt.
President Trump has used tariffs to try to, as leverage to try to forge trade deals or cooperation with countries that the U.S. does business with. Do you support Congress making a requirement that tariff policies be subject to congressional oversight or approval?
Well, I think it's in the Constitution that it should be. You know, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 says Congress has the ability to regulate commerce. And this is the problem. Congress is not doing that right now because they are following their president. The Congress is run by Republicans, and they don't want to stand up to their president. And I have a real problem with this, because the tariffs are really hurting the 6th District of Kentucky. They're hurting the bourbon industry. Toyota's not happy about this. The farmers, the soybean farmers, have totally lost their profit margin this year because of these tariffs. And I'll tell you, you know, when Andy Barr comes out and says, well, I'm against the tariffs, but I'm unwilling to do anything about them, it shows you the ineffectiveness of him as a legislator, because he's literally putting his party above his district. He knows that these are wrong. He knows that they're hurting the district, but he can't stand, he's incapable of standing up to the president. And that's the problem I have.
Let's talk immigration quickly. Do you support abolishing ICE, which is a priority for some Democrats?
No, I don't. In fact, I went to the border to look at both sides of this issue. To look at both sides of the border and to try to find out what was going on. And I talked to ICE agents, I talked to Border Patrol. These individuals are law enforcement individuals. They are not the ones who are the enemy here. They're just doing their job. And so, you know, I just don't believe that we should be abolishing. We can reform what they do, but that has to happen at the congressional level. That has to happen at the policy level. And that's something that we ought to look at.
School shootings across the country and here in Kentucky and other mass shootings have prompted some to call for tighter gun restrictions. What is your stance on that?
Well, I'm very concerned about school shootings, and I do believe that we should have you know, better background checks in this country. We need to close the gun show loophole. We should be working on making sure that people who are committing crimes and like this do not have access to these weapons. I think that's a priority. So.
Amy McGrath is a candidate for Congress. She is the Democrat running against Republican incumbent Andy Barr, who will be with us next week. We'll talk some more issues before we go on Kentucky Newsmakers. Welcome back to Kentucky Newsmakers on WKYT. Amy McGrath is with us. She's the Democratic nominee for Congress in Central Kentucky. Her opponent is Republican incumbent Andy Barr. We're continuing with some issues. The opioid crisis is just horrid here in Kentucky. We're losing about 5 Kentuckians a day to overdoses, and many more lives and families are being ruined and pulled apart. Congressman Barr did hold a field hearing here in Central Kentucky to discuss the issue. President Trump has declared an emergency, a public health emergency on this. Are they doing enough?
No. You know, declaring an emergency is good, but there's got to be some action behind it. And so when I look at the opioid crisis, first of all, it's a health crisis. It's a public health crisis. And if you look at history, how have we mitigated or overcome in this country public health crises in the past? We overcame polio in the 1930s and 40s. We overcame or mitigated HIV/AIDS in the 1980s. And how do we do that? We did it coming together as a country, and we invested in science, and we invested in research, and we invested in treatment, and we invested in education. And those are the types of things that we need again. We're not going to be able to lock our way out of this and throw people in jail. We're not going to be able to do that by just calling it a crisis and leaving. Communities need help. Communities here in the 6th District need help. They don't have the money to do lots of things that we need to do for prevention and treatment. And at the federal level, we need a lot more investment.
Congressman Barr has pushed for some transitional housing, some help in getting a job assistance and that sort of thing. Are you supportive of that?
I'm certainly supportive of those measures, but it doesn't go far enough. When you talk to folks who really know what they're doing in terms of prevention and treatment here, what they'll tell you is we need a lot more money invested in treatment centers, in treatments that work. And this issue is not going to be fixed overnight. It's going to be long term, and we have to be honest about that.
College students are leaving school with huge amounts of debt in many cases because they've taken out loans that will weigh them down financially for a long time. Congressman Brett Guthrie out in the 2nd District pushed through a bill that says if you take out a student loan, you should be required to enroll in financial literacy classes. Do you like that approach?
I mean, I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't think that that's really the problem. That's basically blaming the students for this. I think that may be a form of education, but the reality is the price of college has just skyrocketed. So I think that we have to look at that. I like things like the idea that you can serve, as a GI Bill as an example, that you would serve your country. I like the idea of service to country in multiple ways, not necessarily in the military as a way of paying back. But we definitely have to look at this issue and figure it out.
The Bluegrass Army Depot over in Madison County is on track, it looks like, to get rid of the nerve agent that is stored over there. But that money has to be continually appropriated.
That's right.
How big of a priority is that for you?
Well, it's an extremely big priority. Number one, because we have to live up to our agreements per the Chemical Weapons Convention and get rid of our chemical weapons. And that's going to take several more years. And so we have to do that in an environmentally friendly way, and that costs money. So that is extremely important, not only for the 6th District, but for our country and for the world. So, you know, and beyond that, we have to look at that, the Bluegrass Arsenal there and figure out what we're going to do next after that, and I'm working with that.
The emerging Farm Bill will likely legalize hemp nationwide. It looks like that is going to be part of the final measure. Are you on board with that? I
am. I talked about this in my 32-page economic plan, that we need to be doing that. It's a crop that Kentucky should have been doing for a while, and something that is very valuable.
Medical marijuana?
I'm for medical marijuana. I am. I believe, and also the American Legion is for that, and I stand with the veterans of the American Legion and think that we should have done that yesterday.
A few seconds left. What have you learned in this campaign about yourself, about this district that you want to represent, and about the state of politics in our country?
What I've learned is that people really want leaders they can be proud of. And they want leaders who aren't going to lie to them and have integrity and character, and people who have served the country and want to serve them. As far as learning about myself, you know, every challenge is different. I've had a lot of challenges in my life, and this is just another one. And you know, you adapt and you overcome, and you make mistakes along the way, and you just keep pressing forward because you try to do what's right, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Thanks for coming. We appreciate it.
All right.
And Amy McGrath, the Democratic nominee for Congress in Central Kentucky, will have Republican Andy Barr next week. That's Kentucky Newsmakers. Have a good week ahead.